book got smudges on it. Good evening. Good evening. How is everyone? Hi, I'm Vivian Fisher, and I would like to welcome each and every one of you to the Enoch Pratt Free Library for our Writers Live series. This evening is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Jocelyn Nicole Johnson, who is a native Virginian, an American teacher and author. Johnson grew up in Reston, Virginia, graduated from James Madison University, and pursued a career teaching visual arts in public schools throughout the Virginia area to elementary age students throughout Virginia. She is the author of My Monticello, a fiction debut that was called a masterly feat by the New York Times, and a winner of the Weatherford Award, the Balcons Fiction Prize, and the Lillian Smith Award. She has won numerous awards, including the Penn Faulkner Award, the Penn Faulkner Fiction Award, and the Story Prize. The New York Times listed My Monticello as one of the 10 best fiction books and as a notable book of the year. This debut novel has received rave reviews and is being adapted for a Netflix film. Writers have commented, absolutely unforgettable. Johnson's prose soars to new heights. Chilling, thought provoking, and expertly crafted, Johnson's stories broke my heart as well as my brain. Pitch perfect, riveting storytelling. This incandescent work speaks not just to the moment, but to history. This evening, Mecca Jamilah Sullivan is going to be her moderator. She is the author of three books, which includes the short story collection Blue Talk and Love, winner of the 2018 Judith Makausowitz Award for Emerging LGBTQ Writers, and her recently released novel Big Girl. She is an associate professor of English at Georgetown University. Please join me in welcoming Jocelyn Nicole Johnson and Mecca Jamilah Sullivan to the Pratt Library and to Baltimore.
Thank you all.
Yes, hi everyone.
I see a friend from college here. I'm so excited. Didn't know it.
So, okay, my mic is on. So this is great. I'm so excited to have this conversation about My Monticello. And we thought we'd begin maybe by just, sort of entering the world of the book for a couple of minutes. And I think Jocelyn would read a little bit and then we can just jump right into conversation.
Yeah, so I'm going to read a little bit from a story called Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse. I wrote this before the pandemic, and I was thinking about how it's hard to plan for the future when you're not sure if there is a future, if the world feels like it's kind of falling apart, but that can be kind of like tragic, but it's also kind of funny. This character is thinking like, I really want to buy a house before I turn 40, but she's also like, what kind of hairstyle will I have like when the apocalypse comes as a Black woman? You know what I mean? Like all those kind of concerns smushed together. So I'm going to read a tiny bit of that. And this is in the form of a list. So it's bulleted little bits. So I'm just going to kind of jump around and read just a little bit of that. Buying a house ahead of the apocalypse. Scour online listings daily. Find a house ahead of your 40th, ahead of your imminent doom. Never mind that a house is an investment, a belief that things on the whole will get better. Find a house on the hill, set far from the road, a sturdy brick rancher or a quaint bungalow that needs work. Search outside of Richmond, not too far from the city, since baby girl's still finishing art school there. Keep up your commute, rising well before dawn to burn up the road to Williamsburg. Never mind the long drive, the lights you've left on, the busted toilet your landlord won't fix, which is always, always running. I think I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. So there are so many threads and themes that I see sort of moving through this collection. We've got a number of stories here, right? So we've got several short stories, and then we've got this rich, incredible, beautiful novella. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about just sort of how you understand the book as a whole, what themes and threads you see kind of running through these different stories, and your sense of sort of like what brought you to this particular set of stories that we see together, sort of bound and joined in the book.
Yeah, so this is a collection that has 5 short stories, a big novella that takes up the bulk of it. And so I was just writing stories. I was teaching public school full-time in Virginia. I taught visual arts for 20 years. And so I was writing these stories in the summer, kind of all over the place. And then at some point it occurred to me that the story that I had set so many stories in Virginia, there was this kind of theme emerging of home. And the big thing about it was kind of, I was born in Virginia. My mom, my dad, my older brother were all born in South Carolina. So I'm kind of a first generation Virginian. And there was this way in which my parents moved to Virginia for economic reasons and for opportunity, but South Carolina, Lexington was home. It was where my millions of cousins lived, my grandmother and everything. So I had this kind of inherited weird sense of home. We would drive home 10 hours to South Carolina, and then we would drive back home to Virginia. So it was like, what does this mean? What does this place mean? And in recent years, that idea of home, that idea of a complicated sense of home has been brought back to me through things that have happened in our country, in Virginia, and the stories were starting to reflect that. So I realized that I wanted these stories to kind of be about home and belonging, or I was already writing stories about that. And so then I started writing into those ideas even more. I wrote the novella last, and because I wrote it last, and by then I had this idea of these stories like pins and a map of Virginia. And so I pulled ideas from some of the stories I'd already written. So there's a story called Virginia's Not Your Home in the collection. And then that line became a line in My Monticello, the novella. And so I really did think of them, and by the end, as in kind of talking to each other and in conversation with one another. And then I was really lucky that someone let me try to publish them together, because it doesn't make sense. There are no novella short story collection debuts. I had one prospective agent tell me to write 2 novels before I published this book.
Wow.
Just 2, nothing big.
Right. Well, that person was clearly wrong, right? I mean, it's funny that, you say it doesn't make sense, and yet it does make sense. It works so well here. And I think, hearing you mention this theme of home, it really does sort of ground us, right? The Virginia as home, but also we get all of these kind of intimate relationships that create spaces of home. And the notion of kind of the question of whether or for whom the United States is home. I think these are questions that I hear kind of echoing throughout each of these stories. And I guess that brings me, you touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious to hear more about your process, the kind of origin story of this book. You mentioned, which is so fascinating to hear, that some of the shorter stories sort of came from moments or lines in the novella, and that they're in conversation with one another. The novella especially, right, and all of these stories, are very timely. And I notice this is one of the terms that sort of keeps coming up in discussions of this book. And I think that's absolutely accurate. And yet, as a writer, I imagine that some of these themes and these ideas have actually been with you for quite a while. I'm thinking in My Monticello, which is the novella, right, we get all of these sort of very urgently relatable, sort of story elements, right? This notion of a kind of national crisis around race, the sort of urgency of climate crisis, state-sanctioned violence against people of color. And at the same time, we get these sort of very sort of enduring, almost timeless relationship stories that are at the center. And this is a way of asking, do you see this as a story that's kind of like a ripped from the headlines? Do you see it as something that began in you earlier in your relationship with, sort of thinking through the world earlier, especially now as we think about the kind of like near future of, our nation, of our communities, right? Like all of these things are very timely. And yet I think for a lot of us, these things are also timeless. So I'm curious to know how you respond or what you think about that as sort of part of the story's origin.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know. I like literary fiction, which is just a genre, right? It's a kind of fiction that has certain characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this idea that's like, in literary fiction, it's supposed to be not about what's going on today. But that's totally, yes, in my opinion, like everyone is writing in response to what's happening to them. What's happening to them at an intimate level between someone they walk by and they see them do something and that sticks in their brain, and that's the material for a story.
Right.
Or it could be something that they see in the news. For me, there's probably two stories in here that are very much a reaction to things that happened in Charlottesville that you might have seen in the news. There was the opening story, Control Negro, was a response to a university student, Martise Johnson, who was in 2015 bloodied by black honor student, who was bloodied by uniformed officers coming out of a bar, and they assumed his ID was fake, and he ended up with like 11 stitches in his head. And there was a lawsuit, and there was a whole bunch of things that happened. And that sat with me. It wasn't that I thought, oh, I'm going to write a story about this. It just sat with me, and it sat with me in this really complicated way, because I was thinking about, how do you prepare your child for the world? Why do I have to say honor student to try to create a safety around this person, to say they didn't deserve to be beat up because maybe they had a fake ID? What does it mean to try to protect our children in ways that make them feel, is it its own injury to protect try to protect a child from racism or sexism? When we ask our daughters to dress a certain way to be safe in the world, we do this to our children. Like we all do this. We all can do this. It's very normal. So when I'm writing, it's usually something that bothers me, and that and it can be something just in the world like that. With the novella, I was responding to August 12th, 2017 in Charlottesville, when we had the Unite the Right rally with can you all hear me?
I think it's your hair.
I'm sorry. I'm getting signals from the back. Can you all hear me? Is it better now?
Yes.
Thank you. Please do tell me if it sounds bad. So that was a really strong reaction to something in the news. But the other stories, all of them are reactions to things that happened to me, right? And they aren't necessarily translations. None of them are exact translations to what happened. The first story, I turn it completely inside out to the most weird and crazy experiment that a father's, having a black father's having on his son to try to test America. That's not what happened with Martise Johnson, but the ideas of it came from something real. But in the other stories, they came from other real things that happened to me or that I observed, or one is a story I heard from a friend who was a teacher and never saw any of the people involved, the King of Xandria, but I imagined this immigrant father. And so I think all we have to write fiction from is our experience and the things we see and the things we notice. So you're constantly collecting and making up and imagining the world at the edge of what you're seeing and trying to figure out why someone is the way they are. My mom looks out the window and sees the neighbor limping, is like, I bet she fell out of the bed yesterday. She's making up a story of why that person is the way they are. And I think I inherited it, but I just make it into stories.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned sort of literary fiction, right, as, a genre that can, in fact, sort of more fully grapple with realities, right? That like it isn't just, a way to get at something sort of like abstract or philosophical, right? Like it can help us sort of understand various aspects of reality. And one of the things that I notice, especially in your short stories, is you do that so well through character, right? I mean, in the piece that you just read for us, it's this really sort of interesting character who's sort of thinking through imagining her near future, right? Or imagining sort of what her future is going to look like in the apocalypse, but we get all of these other really rich, interesting characters, and we get several different point of view strategies. And I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about sort of why that's important to you. I was struck right away. We get, really interesting first person point of view strategies. We also get a kind of second person point of view, especially in those kind of bullet points that we heard just now. We get a first person plural short story, kind of a collective we, in Something Sweet on Our Tongues. And I just would love to hear you talk a little bit about, like, is there anything there, as I'm hearing these different points of view, they're helping me to sort of create a sense of a community, right? I'm hearing sort of multiple voices thinking through these same ideas of what home means, of what the future might mean, of what American life is. And I wonder for you, what does that play with point of view and other craft elements, but especially point of view and character? Like, what does that do for you as a writer?
Yeah, I don't set out and say, oh, I'm going to write a story in a we form. I just am looking at a bunch of, so the Something Sweet on Our Tongue, the story you talked about is about a bunch of school children who are like kind of wreaking havoc on the day. And they're like this group of boys and they're kind of testing their masculinity with one another and they're vulnerable, but they're also like tough. And so we just came out as a way to think of, I was, as a teacher, when you see the kids and they kind of become a collective mob against you and you're like, I must control them, but they're like, and I think that's really funny and interesting. And so it made sense to try writing in that form. For Buying a House at the Head of the Apocalypse, I had the idea of someone literally trying to buy a house and is the world falling apart? We don't know. Maybe it really is. And I tried to write it in scenes and it wasn't working. And then I just kept playing around until I got this. I'm a compulsive list maker. Like I literally have list. I have a list for today. And then I put a Post-it on the list with like a little side addendum list. And then I have to flip the paper over to make a neater list. So that form I had probably sittings by my side. And I thought, oh, I'll try to write it in this. This story, Virginia's Not Your Home, is in you form. They hung that name on you at birth, but Virginia was never your home. So it's her telling herself, this woman telling herself the life of her story, her life, kind of in a kind of chiding herself and encouraging herself, but then also like warning herself, And so I think it's just playfulness and what seems to fit and make sense. I wrote The King of Xandria, the story of an immigrant father. I'm like closely over his shoulder because, some of his biography is very different from my biography. So it made sense. And there's this distance in him. So it made sense to write it from, like, if I was just over his shoulder and the words the story used are his word, the kind of words he might use, but it's not coming from that eye because there's a little bit of distance in it. And that makes sense. So I think I just play with going all over the place and what seems, and I try to listen to what works. And sometimes just the instinct of that first sentence tells you that this is where you're going. And then you have to figure out why. Why, Buying a House ahead of the apocalypse, she's writing a list because that's what we do. We want to accomplish something. And she's trying to accomplish buying a house. Whereas the first story, Control Negro, it's a father writing to a son. There's a reason it's written that way. The form has to lend something to the story.
Well, this then brings me to another question that I've been so excited to ask you, the form of the novella. I think you don't hear enough about the form of the novella in general. You mentioned that, an agent suggested, oh, you have to wait a while before you can publish this novella and short stories. Why is the novella as a form important to you? Why was it the right form for this particular story?
Yeah, so, a lot is made out of a novella, but to me, it's just like novel with a little LA on the end and it's shorter in a way, right? It's like, I just wrote it shorter and then they said you need to put some more stories in there. There's a way that's true, but it's not exactly true because, I wrote that as a story. I wrote it as a shorter story and it just didn't have enough middle. Like it had a beginning, it had an end, but you didn't have enough time with, it's a story of, if you haven't read it, it's a story of a diverse group of neighbors who kind of in a very near future that pretty much is now, climate, things are falling apart with the climate, there's social upheaval, infrastructure's falling apart, and then some kind of emergency happens where the power's out and they're really isolated, and then a bunch of white supremacists roll into their neighborhood, which is the street around the corner from my street, for real, on First Street, and start setting houses on fire and just this group of neighbors flees in a jaunt bus, and they end up driving up to Monticello, which is 10 minutes from my home. And the person who takes them, the teller of the story, is an imagined young descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, which there are descendants of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings that live in Charlottesville, where I live. I actually saw a woman stand up who was one, and that's what gave me the idea for this protagonist. And they end up taking refuge in Monticello and eventually creating like this kind of community there, and other people come. So, so I had a beginning. I had so much feeling around that event, and I was just spent like a year thinking, how do you respond to this? How do you respond to this? How do you respond to this obscenity? What is the right way to respond to this obscenity? Going to my school and teaching little kids the next day who said, what do we do with this? Looking at my son who was, 11 years old at the time, and saying, how do I explain the world to you? What is the world to you if this is one of the first things you will remember about it? And so this novella was my response. The story was my response. So I had a lot of information, a lot of thoughts in my head about it, but I had to figure out how to make it work as a story, and it needed more of a middle. But what it retained from the short story form, besides just being shorter, is that it has kind of a short story type of sensibility and a short story type of ending, which I think novels are, everything's tied up, everything's pulled together in a way. And I am really thankful that I was able to do that. And I think part of being able to do that had to do with it being part of this collection and having the other stories to go back to, and having all the connections between them. And I actually also read Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, which is set up kind of like a novella and has these Roman, I ended up, the character in the story is reading that book in Monticello, because I'm sure it's in their library. And so she's writing this account, thinking about her great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and her great-great-great-great-grandmother, and she's writing and kind of mimicking him in that form. So that kind of was another reason, like in my mind, why is she writing it this way? Why does it look this way?
There are so many more questions that I want to ask, but since we're talking about the novella, I wonder if this is a good time to read just a little bit from the novella.
I'll read I'm just going to read the opening paragraph because it will give you an idea of how the novella starts. The main character, Denasia Love, is giving us this account from Monticello. She's telling you how they came to be there. My Monticello. We claimed it first, this little mountain. Me and Ma Violet and a scattering of neighbors, all of us fleeing First Street after men came to set our row of tin-roofed homes on fire. The men came at dusk, blaring an operatic, "Oh, say, can you see?" White heads rose up from dusty jeeps, and dark hair thrashed in a harsh new wind like tattered flags. Ours, the men shouted. Their rifles gleamed as if they'd only just been bought, a megastore militia. Through a hasty breach in Ma Violet's blinds, I even saw a boy among them, blonde and sneering in a pickup window. Men leapt from back seats, sprang out of truck beds, and rushed towards the faces of our homes. White hands clutched metal canisters, swung torches spilling flames. Bright shouts, the rising haze of smoke, all that and more rousted us out. From our patchy front yards, we saw bodies blur as some of our neighbors charged forward to try to stop them. We saw a teen struck with the butt of a rifle, his temple spraying red. A toddler flailed, diapered and clinging to its mother's hip as she sank knees first to the sidewalk. What we saw in those moments riveted us, and then it set us free. So that's kind of the start of the novella.
I mean, it's so powerful. And this is less a question than a comment. what you do with visual imagery is so powerful. It grounds us. And I think even just from that one paragraph, we feel the kind of urgency, the presentness of this scene, partly because we see the scene as Denisha is seeing it, right? We see it in glimpses. We see this, these very sort of precise, but somehow scattered images as she's trying to sort of put together what it is that she sees. And you're able to sustain that sense of kind of, incredible precision, even in moments of sort of visual, cacophony for the length of the novella. It's, it truly is, it's incredibly striking. As a writer, I'm like, how on earth does she do this? When I learned that you are a visual artist, right? I'm like, okay, that, it helps me to understand how that's happening. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about the place of seeing, of sight, of vision, either in your creative practice or in that story in particular. What is it that we need to see through Denisha's eyes, and or what is sort of seeing as an artist bring to you as the architect of this story?
Yeah, people have asked me that. I mean, I think you only write the thing that you can write. And everyone has kind of these interesting ways that they interact with the world that only they know about. They might not even be aware of the lens they're seeing the world through. And I think I definitely am a visual art teacher. I definitely am, like my mom, I'm peeking out of the blinds. I'm really unjudging. I'm just kind of constantly collecting information. And even in that scene, there's all these things that happened really, truly on August 11th and 12th. Like my son, someone who worked at my son's daycare was, a Black dude was beat up by these white supremacists and he was hit over the head. So that vision was like a direct relation to that. But also the baby the mom picks up. I was driving down my First Street one day and literally a little kid was left not well taken care of, walked out, and I pulled my car over and the child let me pick them up. And the feeling of first of all, no child should let you do that, but it was a really sweet little child. And luckily I was a safe person and I found where they were supposed to be and we figured it out. But so if you're constantly looking, you're gonna see in your stories, or your stories are gonna hold all those images, right? It's like a way to, for me, writing when it's working well, is almost I think if you're kind of an introvert like me, I'm collecting all these things and then it's a way to share them, so they don't go to waste. It's all the things that you notice that maybe no one noticed. You want to put them somewhere where someone else can notice. So I definitely do think that is true. And one thing I try to do, and it can be hard for me, is just to remember to be in the bodies of the people. And just in that story, I was really trying to show how Denisha feels, and also to show the injury of racial violence in the psyche of a person, right? Because I wasn't physically beat up and I wasn't bloodied, but there was an impact, right? And so what does it feel like to just have someone say, you shouldn't feel at home here. You shouldn't feel safe here. You shouldn't feel safe in your skin when you walk around. To really blatantly say it, to be screaming it in your face kind of thing. So I wanted to think about that too. So I don't know if that totally answered. But.
No, it absolutely does. Yeah, it absolutely does. And what you're saying about, sort of being in the body of your characters, your narrators, right? Sort of grounding yourself in the narrator's body as a way of understanding the psychic kind of, experience of racial violence, right? That's really profound for me. And that too is something that comes across so vividly. And again, so sort of urgently. You get the sense that we are there in various moments of different kinds of racial violence. And so, we're talking about this sort of, again, very, sort of physically violent, right, and sort of physically dynamic scene that we're seeing at the start of My Monticello. But you also mentioned, the different forms of racial violence that come into play. For example, in Control Negro, the kind of internalization of anti-Blackness that we see in a few of the stories, the notion of kind of Black respectability, right? All of these arguably are forms of, or manifestations of, forms of racial violence. And at the same time, we see, sort of race and racial dynamics portrayed with tremendous nuance, tenderness. We see these incredible sort of expressions of Black joy. I'm thinking again about Something Sweet on Our Tongues, but even the scene that you just mentioned with the baby, There are these beautiful moments of celebration. We see Black love. And so in some ways, this is maybe a kind of reductive or simple question, but the nuance and the nuanced portrayal of Blackness in America and of kind of, the racial landscape of America in a contemporary moment is so well done here. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about sort of basically your approach to race and to, sort of racial experience in these stories.
I'm gonna invite Mecca to be like in my house, and then when I'm trying to write my new book, she can like say nice things.
I'm gonna say all the nice things. I got you.
Be my hype person.
That's right.
So one thing I love, I think the writer Danielle Evans said this. Maybe it wasn't her, but I love the idea of a short story collection because it resists the idea of one story immediately. And there's this ridiculous way in which if you're writing about a Black character, then you're writing about Blackness. Like you couldn't have a short story collection full of white people and it wouldn't be, is it about whiteness? I mean, there's this just odd expectation on it. But because I did write a story collection that has all Black protagonists in it, I love the idea that they're all different from one another. And if you were to read just the story Control Negro alone, then you probably wouldn't want to meet me. And then, but then when you read the next story, you think, oh, that's not the only thing she has to say about this. And then you read the next story and you said, yet again, that's a whole different thing. And so I really appreciate being able to write different characters and to take one idea and not have it be a stand-in for all of some kind of person. And even I think that comes just from my way of being. It comes from being a public school art teacher, being a public school teacher, where you're just seeing like all the people in the community smushed into one classroom and like, and recognizing all the ways people can be similar, all the ways they can be different. Even in the novella, when it stands alone, I have a whole community of people in there.
Absolutely.
And I wanted it there to be, there's like, it's a dystopian novel, but there's a little tiny secret utopia in it because all these people they make a choice in contrast to the men with fire, the men with banners, the men with guns. They make a choice to be family to one another and to take care of one another and to work together and to create this kind of alternate women-led, Black-led little utopia, but that welcomes all kinds of people. And so that's my like secret revenge. I'm basically trying to get revenge and say all the things I don't believe, and I don't have any control over the world, but I have control of these stories. And so there's something like so satisfying about being able to choose what to highlight and choose who to highlight and choose to show people who are extremely flawed, but also still have some kernel of love and care and humanity, I hope, in them, because that's kind of how I believe that people are.
So you mentioned the writer Danielle Evans, and it's funny, as you were talking, I was thinking also about my friend, the writer Amanasa Forna, who talks about sort of as you were saying, sort of observing and collecting things and sort of secreting them away for later. She calls that the stuff bank. She sort of saves stuff for her stuff bank. I'm curious, like first of all, who are your influences? Of course, Octavia Butler, right, has been brought up a lot. Rightfully, I think, in connection with especially my Monticello, the idea of a kind of speculative look back at history, or sort of using a kind of speculative future as a way to imagine, accessing the past or accessing history, especially through a love story, which I think is something that, we see happening in my Monticello. But when I think about the short stories, I also hear echoes of Toni Cade Bambara, several other writers that I feel like I'm hearing. So I'm curious to know sort of who are some of your literary influences and who are some contemporary writers that you admire, that you respect. Who are you reading right now?
Yeah, so I kind of read all over the place. And I definitely think I owe a debt to Octavia Butler because there's a piece of this that I like to borrow from genre, and I think what she did was take genre and totally turn it inside out, using speculative fiction, using science fiction to talk about the world, which all of it does. But because she's a Black woman, she made it more. It first of all was considered more on the page, but she also did make it more about the relationships, and she definitely used time travel to talk about about slavery, right? In a way that you can't talk about it if you're going to talk about it in the time of slavery. If you take a contemporary person and time travel them there, it's an entirely different prospect. So definitely owe a debt to her. Writers like Toni Morrison were really important to me. Writers like Richard Wright. Like I remember reading Native Son. My parents had it on their bookshelf when I was a kid. And I'm sorry, Black Boy. And it just goes into poetry, right? So it's just him describing this life. And then it's like, it was, you know, the ants and the blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Like this is, I just thought that so stuck with me, this idea that you can put poetry in the middle. You can put, it's like collecting observations, right? And seeing how, you know, a person is having experiences, but they're also having this kind of rich internal world that someone looking at them might not have access to. I love Danielle Evans. I read her first collection, and I got to interview her in Charlottesville in her first collection. And she actually has, her newer collection is a novella and short stories, The Office of Historical Corrections, which I would recommend. A writer that I love is Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. I don't know if you all haven't read him. His first collection is called Friday Black. It's like a play on Black Friday. Highly recommend it. He is brilliant. He has a new book that's coming out this year. That's a novel, but he talks about race and consumerism and the world in a really unique way and really beautiful way. I love writers like Charles Yu, who is a contemporary writer. He won the National Book Award for his second novel, but he uses science fiction to talk about he uses time travel and science fiction to talk about like the immigrant having the immigrant experience in a way. Like I like it when people take something that doesn't go together, something that's just like an oddly shaped thing and puts it next to something else. And then it makes you see something that's extremely obvious that you didn't see before in that. Writers like that. And I love just beautiful language and that kind of thing.
I love that. And it makes me sort of, I'm so curious, you mentioned that I think you mentioned, right, that there's another book sort of in the mix that's on the way. I'm curious to hear whatever you are sort of willing to share about what's next, but especially, do you see yourself sort of continuing in that vein of sort of using genre to do the unexpected? And will these themes of home continue to be of interest to you?
I think that this book, My Monticello, is like my worst fears. I took basically my worst fears about environmental stuff and about racism and about our capacity to be unkind to one another. But then remember there's a utopia in it, which is all the things I think that we also can do. But this book is kind of about that. And I really wanted, there's a thread of climate that goes through this book. And I wanted to look at, I mean, it's so hard to talk, it's hard to talk about race and racism. It is very hard to talk about climate. So I'm like, how can I try to speak about what's unspeakable? And so that's something I'm thinking about. And I really wanted to think about, I love outsider characters you don't expect. So what can a character you don't expect bring to this in the way of solutions that can help us see what might be possible, what might be different than how we're dealing with it now? Because I just think it's what we have to be thinking about. And it's what I'm obsessed with in a weird way. And what I'm kind of avoiding too. Like, I don't want to know what I need to be doing. And the million ways that I'm doing it wrong. So how can I force my character to reckon with that in a way that will help me to do it? And maybe the last thing I'll say about this book is I wrote this and I was like, now you all can worry about the things that keep me up at night and I can go to sleep. And so that's what I want to do with the next one with climate. I'm like, all you can do is put it in the world and be an example in the world that you want to try to see. But then I can hand it to readers and hopefully they can help me to figure out a solution.
I love that so much. Well, I have a couple more questions, but I want to make sure that we have time for a conversation. So this is a good time if you have a question or a comment for Jocelyn. I think we've got 2 microphones, one on either side of the room. And yeah, sort of think about it. While folks are kind of gathering the questions, I'll ask my last question. Related, I think, in some ways to what you're saying, you know, we see love, right, sort of manifest in all of these different ways in in the book, My Monticello, and the stories, and in the novella, but especially in the novella, we see the romantic love, of course, between Knox and Denasia. We see the intergenerational love for Ma Violet and the kind of communal love that she represents. Then there's this question of love and history, the question of whether love would be possible in a context of enslavement, for example. And then this kind of question of sort of how do we engage with the past, either through love, how do we use love as a way to kind of get to the past? Early on, Denasia asks, why is it that we love what we love? And then Knox later asks her, is it possible for you to love me? And then Denasia later asks a question that's not explicitly about love, but I hear love in this question. She says, what am I supposed to do with these ancestors? And what did it even matter now? And so I guess, I'm thinking I would love to hear you talk a little bit about sort of love in the book. What does love mean in the book? What does it mean, especially in relationship to the past and to these, again, the theme of home, the theme of American racial history? What love does work do in the novel, especially for, as Denasia puts it, quote, lighting the way back home? And are there ways that love, is there a sort of a place where love is not enough and what can take over at that point?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question.
Lots of questions. So whatever sort of speaks to you in there.
I don't know the answer, but I know that it appeals to me, and it is aspirational, but it's also the way that I understand our space and our capacity as people. I mean, I think that we, in our best versions of ourselves, that's what we feel when we're kind of realized. Like even just when we walk by a stranger and we see them and I do think we have maybe I'm just weird, but I feel like we have the capacity to love them. I do. And I think it's different than feeling for someone or having empathy for someone or, oh, those poor people, blah, blah, blah. I think that we are connected, whether we see it or not. And to approach that connection with an openness and this idea of love is to recognize that connection and to recognize that what we do to one another and how we treat one another is how we're treating ourselves, and that we need one another. And so I think that is going to be a thread through when I think, what does it mean that those people came to my community in such a hateful way? That has to be the response. That has to be the answer in some way. Even if they're going to fight, even if they're going to do other things, that has to be part of the response in the way they treat themselves and the way they reckon with history and the way that they choose to treat one another regardless. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, come on down. Questions, comments, observations? We'll go with whoever gets to the microphone first. It's like the Price is Right,
You're walking very slowly. I love it.
Hello, I'm Victoria. I'm actually a UVA grad, 05, urban planning. And so I really appreciated this book for kind of taking me back to grounds. I will say if it had not been for Unite the Right rally, it would have been so shocking and like really, really disturbing. But unfortunately, I was sort of prepared for this. But, the My Monticello in a way had this, there's like fantasy, there's a reality, there's like a fun side of the fantasy. I think there was this children's book from the Mixed Up Files of Baisley Frankweiler from like the 90s that I feel like every kid read, where these kids run away and they stay in the museum, and it's kind of this like illicit thing, but there's this fun part to it. So there was a little bit of that, in like, we're in Monticello, we're not supposed to touch the curtains, but now we're touching them, kind of thing. And then there's this reality that, I didn't necessarily think would be my adulthood, that I could imagine these things actually being a reality. And so, as you said, that, the short story, there's not really a tied with a bow ending, but yet it sort of leaves you there hanging with this kind of, we're prepared for a siege, probably, and I read this with my book club recently, and we were all kind of talking about the endings that we would have had. And I think for us, it all varied based off of the day. Like if you'd asked me election day morning, I might have had a different ending than maybe I have today, or maybe I'll have a different thought after the runoff in Georgia, or who knows. But I was wondering if you, through your process, like kept going with the story, if you have your own endings in mind, or if that kind of comes back to you based off of how you're feeling about these heavy issues that you've left with us.
Yeah, thank you for reading it and with your book club. So yeah, the novella ends with a question, the moment where different things are possible. I like my favorite way to think of it is kind of how you did, is that the story has a bunch of endings that are possible. There's the all-white people on the orchard who choose not to help Denasia and the neighbors, and maybe they rally and they decide that even though they're not in immediate danger from the white supremacists down at the bottom of the hill, that they want to do something different. There's, the boys in the yellow house, this kind of brigade that live back in the neighborhood, and maybe they're the cavalry. Maybe the neighbors are able to fend off and hold Monticello themselves. Maybe they are all buried there. They talk about this, if we have to be buried, we want to be buried between Jefferson's graveyard and the slavery grave, the enslaved people graveyard that's in the parking lot of Monticello. With unmarked graves, we want to connect these things. So I think all those possibilities are there, and the difference is what we do in the world for real, right? And if we're thinking about this question of what will the future look like, it is made up of all of our small decisions together and the big ones that we are able to make. So all those answers are there, and I didn't have one answer. It depends on the day, and it depends on, yesterday morning versus today, this morning. How do I feel about it? What are we doing? What are we choosing to do? What could we do? What am I doing? Luck and all the other things. So, yeah.
Good evening, ladies.
Hello.
2 questions I need to ask you. I overheard you say your childhood between you traveling from Virginia to South Carolina, and you blending in with your family and the history. Also heard you said about the Monticello events that were going on right around the corner of your house. If you were to relive it all over again, how would you be able to handle the situation based on your vision of you having the visual art degree, you connecting with the children in the state of Virginia? How are you coping with it right now up to this point?
So if I understand you, thank you so much for the question. I appreciate it. Maybe I said the book was my response. So did it change how I feel about what I would have done or what it means, right? I think I did come up with an answer, but maybe it was the same answer I had, but maybe I just talked myself into it, which is that it has to be this concerted, some sort of sense of community and some sort of sense of how we connect with one another in response. But it's still not an easy question. It kind of depends on the day. I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer, which is why I spent a year thinking about it and then wrote a whole novella, and then I still don't know the answer. But I do think, what do I know about it more? I think I just know more about, I think it's really important not to just see the horror and the spectacle of horror, but also see all the ways in which people try to respond differently, and all the people who, and not negate when people try to think and care differently as whatever, that's not doing anything. It is actually doing something. I think we have to acknowledge that people caring and trying and thinking differently about something is an actual psychic shift that's going to change how they spend their days. Like, I think of my parents they're like really nice people, and they moved to Charlottesville during the pandemic, and they're my neighbors now. And they're just always so surprised when when people aren't terrible. You know what I mean? If they go to Price Club and someone holds the door for my mom and is nice, they're like, these white people were really nice to us today, and this happened. And, and they're kind of delighted by when things aren't terrible, because I think from watching the news, they're kind of conditioned to think that everyone is going to be so horrible. And I think that it's really, really important to note when people are trying and to bring people on. We need on ramps to something better. We just need to be moving better, moving in the right direction, to acknowledge that, to move in that direction together. And I think that we all can have a piece to play in that. And I think it does accumulate, just the same way that hatefulness and nastiness and those other people are the threat can accumulate and become a more physical force in the world. We've seen it. I think it can go the opposite way as well. I hope it can.
Yes, come on up.
Hi, my name's Jane, and just thank you so much for talking to us all today. I worry about this being a little bit rambly in my head, so I'm trying to make it a little bit more concise. But you talked about writing about the unthinkable, kind of the anxieties that are in our head, but also very real in the world that affect us individually and as groups, especially when it comes to the environment or violence that we experience differently, whether that's from racism or misogyny or maybe the intersection of the two. I haven't read your book yet, but would you talk about how your characters dealt with those very real threats and anxieties, whether they found answers to that or comfort in just experiencing it together communally? Because anxiety and fear can be very lonely and very isolating. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I wish I had a really good answer as far as what to do. So I think it depended on the character and the moment, right? There's characters that in the novella, yes, them being together and creating something positive together was a balm, but they're still anxious and they're still worried and it's still like a hard situation. But in other stories, you know, in The King of Xandria, the Samaritan father, he ends up really isolated, but he sees something in the world. He sees these tundra swans. He sees these birds in the corporate pond, and they remind him that, you know, everything migrates. Things are constantly changing. We aren't of just one place. And he has this idea of persistence. So I think for some people, like seeing something in the world that we fixate to can be like this moment of hope or relief. Or in the story, Virginia's Not Your Home, you have this character that's just like restlessly wanting to like get away from where she's from, change her name from Virginia or Jenny to something else. She wants to be in France. She wants to do all these things. And there's a moment in the story where she just like is home. She's on her like mother's land and like the breeze comes through and she's like eating a sandwich from the garden. And it's like, you just are where you are and you are, you know, like there's this like rest, right? There's a pause. So I just think we're just all doing the best we can. And like my characters are too, you know, they find moments that are relief, they find things that help them, but they also are restless and they're, you know, I like that kind of thing in fiction characters. I think there's pleasure in reading because you can see yourself and you can see your own internal world in it, and that can be its own kind of balm. Doesn't mean you're not anxious, but there's something nice about seeing the internal, like that's what I like about literary fiction. You're going to see the insides of people. And I think that can be really pleasurable and really nice.
Are there any other questions? Well, if not, thank you, Jocelyn and Mecca, for this great conversation. So there are books out in the hallway for Jocelyn to sign. So please go out and purchase your books. And thank you so much again for this great conversation. It was very enlightening. I can't wait to read your book. I think it's going to be, according to the reviews, it's going to be very, very entertaining and great. You have great reviews on this book. So please go out and purchase your books.
Thank you.
Holidays are coming up. They make great gifts.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much.